everyone. Gosh, we're getting almost to the home stretch here, and we're in the afternoon of day 2. So this is exciting. There's a lot of great content that's going on. Hello and welcome back to Track 3, the Drug Development Future, Science, Policy, Partnership, and Economics. We hope you enjoyed the networking lunch break, sponsored by Avexis. I'm Amy Grover, and I will be your host for this afternoon's session. As a reminder, this track is being live streamed, and I'd like to welcome our remote attendees and remind everyone to download our mobile app to use the live Q&A. In this session, patients and advocates as entrepreneurs, new models for drug development, our experts will tell all you need to know if you are a patient or advocate interested in funding or building a company to focus on rare disease research. Is this the right choice for you? And if so, what does that look like? Or what do you need to know to prepare this pathway? To share their expertise, let's welcome Stephen Laffoon, President and co-founder of Wilder Nation Foundation and Wilder Therapeutics, and Imran Babar, did I do that right? Chief Business Officer of Sidon 2. Welcome, gentlemen. All right,
Thank you.
Take it from here.
Thank you. So first, I feel like I always have to start by acknowledging and thanking the Global Genes for continuing to be so awesome at everything they do and strive to do, and putting on another amazing conference. I think it's been very productive, at least for me. Hopefully it has been for everybody else. So I'm Stephen Laffoon, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about my journey into the rare space, what brought me here, and kind of what we're doing to advance science from our end. I feel I need to clarify. I hear expert and I start to cringe a little bit. I don't know that I call myself an expert by any means, but I think maybe that's where some of the value I hope I can bring to a lot of you guys, because I think maybe you'll find our stories kind of overlap a lot of the time. And so I appreciate you having me, but I do clarify I have no scientific background. I had no drug development background. I'm just a passionate father trying to help his son. And so if you look at this here, this is really why I got brought into this space. I often say I didn't choose rare, rare chose me. And if you look, that's my first son, Wilder. And if you look at the picture on the left, he was about 5 months old right there, and that was not long. We're on the diagnostic journey right there. And about a month later, maybe, we actually received his diagnosis of NiemannPick type A, which is an ultra-rare disease that kind of falls into a larger bucket of diseases called lysosomal storage diseases or lysosomal storage disorders. And so upon receiving this diagnosis, once again, it was a situation that sounds so cliche-ish, but I feel it was true. In not so many words, we were basically told your son has an ultra-rare disease. There's really nothing out there that you can do to help him at this stage. His life expectancy is 18 to 28 months. Go home and enjoy that time while you have it. And so I think a lot of you can probably relate also as a parent. It's kind of a hard thing to do. I wasn't really willing to sit there and watch my son just die in front of my eyes without really trying to do something. So we went on the journey of trying to create our miracle, right? And if you look at that picture on the right, Wilder was maybe just under 2 years old in that picture. And I actually just realized that's a funny picture. His shirt, look at him, he looks like a boss. He's just had a brain surgery and his shirt says, "Lock up your daughters." We had funny shirts, anyway. Anywho, so we were well into our diagnostic journey and trying to really, or not, excuse me, we were diagnosed and trying to create this miracle. So I dug deep into research. I traveled the country, tried to find all of the key opinion leaders to really teach me about this disease, and I was ignorant enough at that point to really think I could do this. And unfortunately, time was just not on our side. And if you go into the middle picture, that is just after Wilder's 3rd birthday and probably about 2 weeks before he passed away. So obviously we weren't able to achieve our goals in Wilder's life. And after he passed away, we took some time, my wife and I took some time, he's our only son at the time, to really figure out what do we want to do, you know? We needed to kind of ground ourselves again and figure it out. And then over the next few months, 6 months or so, families that we became close with, their kids started to pass away. And so I was like, man, this is just, something's got to change, right? We got to do something. And so it wasn't long after that, we founded Wilder Nation Foundation, which was primarily what we wanted to do was use the lessons that we learned in trying to treat Wilder as a catalyst to really move the development process for this particular disease at the very least. And so our general mission, as it states, is to improve the lives of children diagnosed with lysosomal storage disorders and you know, ultimately accelerate the discovery and development of treatment options. We have an overarching mission of lysosomal storage disorders. There's 50 plus of them. We kind of chose that because we feel that our work in one disease could potentially have effects in another disease. So that's kind of why it was a larger mission. But we, you know, for me, it was really a personal mission, right? To take down the disease that took my son's life. And so I'm still on that. It's like a revenge mission, if you will. And you know, we're kind of doing some things to advance that. So our current focus, if I want to get into the disease, I'm not going to go too long about it, but there's 3 main types of Niemann-Pick disease. If you guys have heard of it, a lot of it is type C. It's a different disease in a sense. There are overlapping similarities, but there's a lot of activity around that disease, so most people have kind of heard there. A and B are different than that disease. And they're actually known as acid sphingomyelinase deficiency, and they fall on the spectrum of type A as the very early onset severe form. Type B can be a later onset, even into adulthood before you're diagnosed. And then there's a big spectrum in between of phenotypes. And so our initial interest in doing this and our emphasis at the beginning was naturally because my son was Niemann-Pick type A. And so we felt, how can we make, the difference between type A and type B is type B you can live until you're 50 at times, even later possibly, whereas type A, you're lucky if you hit your 3rd birthday. So how can we shift these children from this A phenotype into this B phenotype and make a significant impact? And so in doing that and learning what I learned in trying to treat Wilder, I realized there's this huge communication problem when it came to this disease, and I think it's a fundamental problem. And so the first thing we did was bring in key opinion leaders, scientists from academia, from industry, clinicians, and really brought everybody that we thought could help us kind of pave the roadmap to developing a treatment option and get a real good understanding, high-level understanding of what do we know about this disease and how can we address this. And so it was a really important step was getting all of these people talking, because prior to this they were just kind of working in their own little areas. And so that's one big benefit I think as a foundation that you have is the ability to kind of facilitate that and get everybody communicating and playing nice together. And when you do that, it's when I think you can make some serious progress. And so our initial strategy when we formed this was really to fund basic and translational research, obviously with the idea of translating into treatment options, but through just traditional nonprofit mechanisms, right? Peer-to-peer fundraising, crowdfunding, family fundraisers. We have an event every year. So your typical route of raising money, as a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit agency. And so we knew we wanted to be partners in our research. from the beginning. We didn't want to just be an ATM. We didn't want to just provide grant money and then wait for a report and then provide more grant money. We thought we brought more value to the table than that. So it was very important for us to be involved in the process of the research as opposed to just funding it. And we spent a lot of time investing in resources up front to assure that value that we thought we had didn't get lost. And so a lot of that comes in the form of painful research agreement negotiations that in the beginning are very can be frustrating because to me at least, it was slowing the process down. But I can't stress how imperative it is to have all of that ironed out up front, because if you try to go back and do it, it slows it down even more. And so you can make sure everybody's on the same page. So in those agreements, it had to do with, and we were very flexible, but IP rights, ownership, data, royalties, just how are we going to make this a sustainable way to go forward. Clicker is a little sensitive. Maybe, can you guys do the next slide from up? There we go. And so it was important to us to have multiple shots on goal. We didn't want to throw all of our efforts into one treatment modality. We didn't want to put everything into gene therapy or everything into a small molecule. We kind of wanted to have multiple options that we could plant out there. I always used to say, let's put the seeds out there and then see what starts to grow, and then we'll figure out where we're going to throw all the water, and put all the gasoline behind it to really get it going. And so we learned and we knew that this was not a sustainable model the way that we wanted to do it. We couldn't just fundraise a traditional philanthropic fundraising way. At least I couldn't. There are groups out there I think that are probably better at it than I am for sure. But we didn't see this being a sustainable way to really make the dent that we wanted to make. And so we knew that there'd be a pathway. We need to create some sort of pathway to find additional ways to get funding, go down some creative avenues to get funding. And so what we ended up doing there, next slide please, was we formed Wilder Therapeutics, which really we formed this organization to help Wilder Nation Foundation achieve its goal of advancing all of our science, and really open up some creative funding avenues other than your traditional nonprofit ways to help us with this goal. And so this was originally set up as a disregarded entity, single member LLC. So what that is essentially, Wilder Nation Foundation is the sole member of this organization. So they own it solely. And I'll explain why we kind of did it. There's, once again, there's multiple ways I think to structure things like this. This was just what we saw fit for the way we were going and what we wanted to do. And so you'll see here, we have Wilder Therapeutics and Wilder Nation Foundation, right? And I'll collectively just refer to them as Wilder Nation. And so we recently filed an international patent for some of our science and for treatment methods for this disease. And so we decided to form another entity called Wilder TX that essentially for the IP that is being placed into Wilder TX in exchange, Wilder Therapeutics, i.e. Wilder Nation Foundation, will have, has a major equity stake in that company, but it also opens up the avenue for us to go get additional investment money, apply for SBIR, STTR grants, through the NIH and, non-dilutive capital, partner license. And so it's more just options. I'm all about, I don't know, when I was treating Wilder, I was like, or trying to treat Wilder, the hardest thing was not having an option for me. I always say options create hope. And I think in the space that we live in, hope is, hope in and of itself is a powerful medicine, right? And so by forming it like this, so you see I have it branched out there like NUCO 1, NUCO 2. We're not there yet. We have options to do that. So if we have some other intellectual property or something that that seems valuable, we can throw it into a different company to get different, in a different investment group, and so on and so forth. And so really the point is to, how can we continue to advance science? And so we're just trying to figure out the ways that we can do that the most expeditiously way possible. And so when we throw something in, like we put this technology, and this is brand new, into Wilder TX, how do we get to the next milestone? How much is that going to cost? We're not out there to start a drug company and manufacture drugs. That, in my opinion, is not the fastest way to start treating these children. We want to get it to a point where someone like a Sidon or another industry partner is willing to come in and take it to the finish line, because that is really how it's done the quickest way. We don't know what we're doing, but we'll continue to move in that direction until we're able to find that partner. So we'll hit a milestone, we'll evaluate, explore other options, and then move accordingly. So, part of this session is starting a company a good option. And the first question that we asked ourselves was, are there other options out there? And I think that goes the same for starting a foundation. I mean, if there's a foundation that's right in your wheelhouse that's doing all of the same stuff, it might be better to join their efforts than starting another one. Same thing with a company. If there was a company that was already developing a drug for this disease, we would have wanted to help them get that to the finish line, because they have the resources more than we do at this stage. But I think when they answer that question, or you get to a point where that's no, then there's a few other questions that we were asking ourselves, and that was, is our science compelling? Do we think that it would be compelling to others? And it just kind of keeps going down. The answer to that was yes. And so then we said, do we have an asset? So in this case, we have a patent an international patent that we filed, that we think is likely to provide a lot of value. And then I think the last question was the team. Do you have the right team behind you? We could have the asset. We could stop at that last one of, do you have an asset? And the problem there is me, passionate father with no drug development experience, no scientific background, trying to talk seriously to a company. I don't think it's going to work. In our case, we have a key, leader, an authority in the disease behind us as part of the team. We have advisors that have done this kind of stuff before that are there to help us, because the fire hose is on and I am drinking as fast as I can. But at the end of the day, you don't know what you don't know. And so we're kind of learning through that, but you got to have the right team in place to execute. So that was the other important thing for us. And so definitely not an exhaustive list here, but some of the things that we had to address, that if this is an avenue that you go down, you may or may have already had to address. Like I said, not exhaustive, I just threw a few things down, but the type of corporate structure, whether it's going to be a corporation versus an LLC, I think a lot of that depends on your end goals. If you're going to go raise serious rounds of money, you might need to be in the corporate side of things. If you're just looking to park something somewhere and partner, LLC might work. So that those are some of the discussions, ownership discussions, types of agreements, consultant agreements, advisors agreements. These are all things that we had to figure out how to put in place. And of course, we don't have any money to pay anybody anything, so we have to have something to offer them. How are you going to fund it? How are you going to build value? How are you going to get to that next milestone? What's it going to cost to get there? Managing conflicts is another thing that comes up that can be very complicated as well at times. And I think at the end of the day, the complicated thing here and what needs to happen is you need to not lose sight of your mission. When you kind of branch into this zone, it's easy to start getting onto that corporate mind thought, I mean, that mind structure, and sometimes that can inhibit advancing things in the most, expeditious way. So if it is a route that you decide to go down, find ways to make sure you don't lose sight of your initial goal, which for us was how fast can we get treatments to these children and get them options, because they currently don't have any. And so I think with that, I'll pass it over to Imran, and he can kind of go through Sidon and kind of pick up where we are now and where they go, and I'll let him kind of take control.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much. So I'm not sure why I agreed to follow your presentation. That's a tough one to follow, and I really want to say that was really inspiring, and I think that the word that comes to mind for me is tenacity. And so, yeah, thank you for all that you've done there.
To Sidon. So it sounds like Sidon wants to be a part of this journey.
We're actually going to be speaking in the next couple of weeks, so let's see here. So I'm trying to advance the slides.
At the point there, it's a little finicky.
Okay, there we go. Good, so I actually might stand, because I like to move around a little bit. But so first of all, I also want to start by thanking Global Genes for putting on a fantastic conference. This has really been inspiring to hear the stories such as Steve's, and also to learn about a lot of the things that are going on now in the orphan disease space. So my presentation is going to be divided into two main parts. First, I'd like to tell you about Sidon, which was the first orphan drug accelerator that was established, and tell you a bit about how we think about drug development in the orphan disease space. And the second part of my talk is going to be focused on some considerations for raising capital if you're an early stage biotech company, leveraging some of my experience in venture capital. And I realize that's not going to be relevant for everyone in the room, but I assume that there are some young entrepreneurs, perhaps parents in early stage companies that will be looking to raise financing. And so I'll speak to some of my experience there. So before I talk about Sidon, let me just tell you a little bit about myself to provide a bit of a framework for where I'm coming from. So I have a basic science background. I did my PhD in molecular biology at Yale, and was truly a science nerd at heart, was and still am a science nerd at heart. Loved digging into biology, understanding the molecular mechanisms that underlie life and even underlie diseases with an aim to fix those diseases. But towards the end of my graduate career, I got a bit of an entrepreneurial bug. And this was really, I think, encouraged by getting together with a small team, a couple of folks who were interested in starting a nonprofit in the rare disease space. And that was really sort of my first kind of deep dive into the rare disease space and recognizing the need in the community. So in 2011, banded together with a small group and formed a nonprofit called Rare Genomics Institute. And it's still active today, as evidenced by a number of my team members who are incredibly dedicated to the organization and doing fantastic work. But we initially got started with trying to help patients in what we call their diagnostic odyssey. So as many of you know, the journey can be a very challenging journey. Sometimes patients will spend, on average, 5 to 7 years trying to find a diagnosis for their condition. And so we said, what can we do to help? And so we basically started a crowdfunding mechanism, a donation-based crowdfunding mechanism to finance research for rare diseases, and specifically to give patients access to genome sequencing. And then with a team of analysts, we really looked to identify variants of functional significance that could potentially help explain their condition. Since then, we've expanded to do a number of other initiatives promoting research for rare diseases and trying to come alongside of companies and of families to advance therapies specifically for rare diseases. So that was really my first foray into the rare disease space. Now, for my day job, I spent some time in healthcare finance. So I started off working at Cowen, which is a mid-sized investment bank based in New York, and I was a biotech stock analyst. Never in a million years would I have seen myself doing that, but I actually really enjoyed it, was able to apply my scientific background, and then also learn all the other things that are involved with moving a drug forward to actually get it to patients. So the regulatory path, intellectual property, the market opportunity, all those things. After spending some time in equity research, I jumped over to OrbiMed Advisors, which is a healthcare investment firm based in New York. I think it's the largest global healthcare dedicated investment firm. And I specifically worked on the venture capital team there for about 5 years. I'm working on a pretty broad range of areas, everything from early stage platform companies, protein degradation, gene therapy, all the way to later stage asset focused companies. And then after working at OrbiMed, I jumped over to join Sidon as the chief business officer. So let me tell you a little bit about Sidon. Great. So Sidon, in a nutshell, is a venture-backed orphan drug accelerator. So Sidon was founded in 2013, really with a focus on specifically advancing therapies in the rare disease space. And our hypothesis, and now our observation, was that there are really interesting projects in the rare disease space that are compelling from a scientific perspective, that the approach is very attractive, but are languishing due to either lack of capital or due to lack of a management team to bring them forward. So Sidon was essentially formed to provide a home for these particular assets. And so the idea was to bring together a funded team of drug development experts and have this team filter through opportunities in the rare disease space and essentially allocate capital towards the most attractive of these opportunities, ultimately with an aim towards advancing therapies. So that's the model in a nutshell. Now, the most important part of the model is going to be to start with the team. If I can get this clicker to work. Here we go. So the Sidon team is small, but I think there are two things that I would highlight. Number one is that everyone on the team is very passionate about advancing therapies for rare diseases. And I think most of us on this team are actually doing side projects in the rare disease space, coming alongside families and doing whatever we can to help progress therapies and even diagnostics for projects that Sidon perhaps is not able to take on. So we're very passionate about rare diseases. The second thing I would highlight about this particular team is again, the diversity of the team with respect to areas of focus and experience. So the team, we have preclinical experience, we've got clinical experience, and we've got business experience. The team comes from large pharma, from biotech, so many, many years of drug development experience, and from finance, from venture capital. So I think those are the things I would highlight about the team that really makes it a successful model. But it's not just the Sidon team, it's also our investor syndicate. So we're funded by a group of 5 investors. I might actually have to rely on you to thank you very much. So Sidon is funded by a great group of investors. So they include NEA, Pfizer Ventures, Longitude Capital, Lundbeck Fund, and Alexandria Real Estate. And these 5 investors have banded together to provide Sidon with a pool of capital. And Sidon 2 has $34 million of what we call essentially walking around capital. And this allows us to essentially find assets, to source interesting opportunities. It allows us to then evaluate and then de-risk those opportunities. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the de-risking phase, which I think is part of the unique part of our model. And then ultimately to form companies around the most promising of these projects. In addition to this $34 million, our investors have set aside just under $200 million in reserve capital that will fund newcos that we will spin out. And they're typically somewhere between $30 to $40 million, but ultimately with an aim to bring them through clinical proof of concept. So the thing that I would highlight about this model is that we have a committed syndicate that funds our de-risking activities as well as our new core formation and funding the Series A for our newcos. And so we don't have to take these projects and shop them to 40 or 50 different investors. We have a committed syndicate that has set aside capital in order to fund those newcos. And out of the Sidon model, there have been 3 what we consider innovative companies that have formed. And I'm not going to go into the details about each of these companies, but suffice it to say, we think that they're in very interesting areas. Our first company, Vitesse, is actually developing a drug for one of the indications that Steve mentioned earlier, NiemannPick C. It's not the one that his son had, but NiemannPick C is a horrible neurodegenerative lysosomal storage disorder. And that company was acquired a couple of years ago by Sucampa, which was then acquired by Mallinckrodt. Mallinckrodt is unfortunately facing some other issues related to the opioid crisis. The second company we started is called Imara, and this company is currently in phase 2, developing a drug for sickle cell disease. So in the hematology space, and they actually recently raised a Series B of $63 million, and they're off to the races. The third company, called Therapeutics, we started earlier this year, and this company is focused on rare neuroendocrine disorders. The lead indication there is non-functioning pituitary adenomas. And there are also other assets in the pipeline and other indications that are being considered. So again, a diversity of areas that Sidon is interested in. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of our model and how it works. So the first, I'm going to go counterclockwise on the schematic. The first is sourcing opportunities. And so we meet with pharma, mid-sized, large pharma. We meet with biotech. We meet with foundations. We meet with academic groups. Anywhere we can find an asset that is potentially at the wrong place at the wrong time. Assets that are being overlooked. Or even assets that are perhaps folks are competing for, but we feel we can add more value to. And we try to be creative, and we try to be, I like the word scrappy in terms of how we think about sourcing deals, really uncovering things. And a lot of times these projects, they have gaps that would make other potentially investors or other groups overlook them and say, that's not interesting. But if we can peel away, the muck or the ways that it's packaged and find value in things, I think that that's what we aim to do. The second part of our process is just typical screening and diligence, and I think many of these are similar. I'm going to go forward a couple of slides just to speak to a couple of things that we look at. So sort of three key areas that I would highlight, commercial, scientific, and clinical. And I'm not going to go through each of these points, but in our diligence and screening process, we pay a lot of attention to the severity of the disease. We're not looking to do just sort of incremental improvements in a very crowded area. We really want to go after areas that are very much underserved. And we want to have transformational therapies that are really going to make an impact for patients. Obviously scientific, I think a lot of groups will pay attention to the genetics, the biology, the underlying biology for the particular disease, predictability of the animal model. So a lot of things that we pay attention to scientifically. We try to be very robust in what we do. And then clinical, we try to be creative, innovative about how we think about clinical endpoints, thinking about biomarkers and anything that we can do to give us confidence on the clinical side. So there's some of the screening activities that we do. And this leads us to our de-risking. For those projects that meet those criteria that we have, we actually have capital available to us to do experiments. And this is where we can spend anywhere from tens of thousands up to about $3 million into an opportunity to essentially fill in the gaps. So we're doing work, for example, if it's a CNS indication, does the molecule get across the blood-brain barrier? Has the molecule been tested in the right animal model, the one that's the most predictive, for example, if a new model has been developed? What does the toxicology profile look like? What is the PK? So whatever experiments we need to do to give ourselves and give investors confidence and conviction that this opportunity is ready to go into patients, ready to go into the clinic. And I think this is part of the model that I would highlight, because I think working on the venture side, very often we'd come across projects, so entrepreneurs, early stage biotechs that had these kind of intriguing projects, but they weren't quite ready for institutional investment. And so we'd say, well, it looks kind of interesting. Come back in 6 months. Come back in a year once you've done these 3 experiments or these 4 experiments, right? And I think if you're on the other side of that, it's a bit frustrating because it's a bit of a catch-22, right? You need data to get capital, but then you need capital to get data, right? And so you're in this never-ending cycle. And so Sidon was really formed to essentially try to address that. We actually are a team that can essentially design and set up the killer experiments, but then also have capital to do them, to get them ready for institutional investment from a major venture capital syndicate. So that's the part where I think that Sidon tries to fill in the gap to make these projects ready for prime time. And then out of that, we will launch our companies, again, which will be well-funded to bring them through the clinical proof of concept. So the next slide, I'm not going to spend too much time on. This is on the funnel. Suffice it to say, we've looked at a lot of projects. This is a little bit outdated, probably about 1,200 projects that we've screened thus far, around 100 that we brought into deeper due diligence, and then probably 15 to 20 that we've actually taken through de-risking. We've actually put capital into these projects. And suffice it to say, we have a relatively high bar. We really want to focus capital on projects that we think that have the best ability to move forward in the clinic and ultimately benefit patients. So it's a really capital efficient model. So to finish up, just to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the projects and areas that we're interested in. I'm not going to go through each of these, but we're interested in neurology, endocrine disorders, muscular, pulmonary, a wide range of indications. Again, a number of indications that we think are underserved, and this list is certainly not exhaustive. I think done a lot of work on quite a range of indications, but we're constantly learning. And I'm always, I guess I'm not surprised anymore, but of diseases that I've never heard of, that I still have never heard of, and that our team has never heard of, we want to learn about them. And so we're constantly doing work to educate ourselves and think about how we could develop a drug for disorders that are largely unserved. So here I'm going to transition to the next part of the presentation. And again, this is really probably more geared towards those who are looking for capital. So apologies for those who are at a little bit of a later stage or for whom this is not as relevant. But raising capital, I think the first thing I would say is that it is, in fact, a continuum. There are a number of different sources of funding, and it really depends on the stage of the company in terms of who you will approach. And so, everything from family and friends. And then I would actually say, this is just my personal perspective. I think I'd personally be careful about tapping into friends and family, especially for healthcare and biotech. I mean, it's a very, very high-risk endeavor, as I think most people here know. With that said, there are other sources, angel investors, family offices, and all the way through to venture capital, and ultimately, if you go public, mutual funds and sort of publicly public investors. And I think there are a number of things to consider here when you're thinking about raising capital. And the next slide is somewhat busy, and I'm not going to go through all of the text here, but I think there's 4 main buckets and 4 main things I'd like to just briefly touch on. One is who to approach. And here, again, it really depends on how much money you're looking to raise, and then ultimately the stage of your company. Right, so there's obviously government funding, grant funding that can be used. High net worth individuals, angel investors, sort of the earlier stages of a company, all the way through to institutional investors. But again, it really depends on how much money you're trying to raise. Now, if you're trying to raise, several $100,000, maybe a couple of $1 million, maybe some of the government or maybe even high net worth individuals, et cetera, can help fund that. But the thing is that I guess I would highlight is that drug development, I think most people here know, is a very capital-intensive industry, right? You're going to require a lot of capital to advance a therapy. Even in the rare disease space, it's very capital-intensive. And most likely, at some point, you're going to have to approach institutional investors, the venture capital investors in the space. And there's sort of debate about when is the right time to go to institutional investors. And but my perspective is I think that getting some of that perspective from VCs early on, it can be very helpful, just in terms of what are they looking for. I'm going to cover some of the things that I think most venture capitalists are looking for, but getting that perspective early on I think is helpful. The second question is sort of what to expect. And I think here, again, it depends on the style of the specific investor, but I think obviously you can expect a due diligence process. So setting up a data room, deep dives, multiple calls with the investors. And ultimately, if a group is serious, they're going to ask you to come in and present to their partnership. So this is where you bring your team and you essentially meet them in person and interact with the entire partnership, the investment syndicate, and present the story. And then if the team is serious, they'll ultimately send a term sheet. And then they're going to try to get some color in terms of what to propose in the term sheet. And your leverage in that situation is there are going to be a lot of factors that determine your leverage in that situation. But that's sort of a general sense of what to expect. If they're serious, they're going to provide a term sheet ultimately. One thing I'll say on this as well. Feel free to stage the diligence, particularly access to the data room. And I'm a little bit mixed in saying this because working at Sidon, we need data room access, and we'll dive in. But I would say that some investors, you'll take one meeting with them and they'll get under CDA, and then they want to see all the the crown jewels of the company, right? Where you're just sort of looking at all the things that are most precious to the company. And I would say wait for signs of more significant interest before you expose the most significant things to the company. Ultimately, I think you need to be very forthcoming, and you need to, you ultimately have to reveal that. But I say, if you want to determine the level of seriousness of a group before you expose everything about your company, especially those things that are most sensitive. What to focus on, again, I don't want to spend too much time here, but just what I'd like to emphasize is not just capital. There are a lot of intangible things about getting investors involved and getting a board involved. And so, for example, how hands-on is the board going to be? I think in certain situations, it's good to have a hands-on board. And for example, some of our investors, they're very hands-on, but they're very helpful. They're sending us opportunities, they're helping us think through opportunities. But in other situations, the board can be controlling. And so I think that you really, when you're taking on investors, I think really think about the dynamic of the board. Things to focus on in terms of the actual terms, there are things such as valuation. If you don't understand pre-money versus post-money valuation, how the option pool fits into that, I would suggest educate yourself on that. Think about tranching strategy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide or two. But how tranching will typically reflect sort of inflection points. And then liquidation preferences. This is sort of like a fine thing, but like for example, if this makes any sense to you, 3x participating liquidation preference. That's very, very aggressive. You don't want that. So understand sort of what are some of the terms that might be thrown in there, protective provisions, et cetera. And the last thing I would just say in terms of tips for success, I think be persistent, but be balanced with that. I think that if an investor, and this is a really key point, if an investor turns you down, be very gracious, but be very professional and be very gracious with it, because you never know. It's almost inevitably, I think my time at OrbiMed, how often companies will come back to us in a year or two when they're at a different stage, again looking for capital. And if they were the type of company that just kind of said, oh, we spent all this time and you didn't invest, and they were very bitter about it, it really looked bad on them, and they didn't really have as good of a shot the second or third time around. So just be mindful of that, I would say, as well. And it can be a frustrating process. Some investors will be very frustrating in terms of everything they're trying to extract from you. And then also, I think just being very clear, and this sometimes where it can be helpful if you have friends in the VC world in terms of framing the story, making sure that your presentation is crisp, straight to the point. I think it can be helpful just to get straight to the point within the first couple of slides. This is essentially what the project is and what we're looking for, right? So next slide is just going to focus on some of the milestones that drive value for a company over time. And I think that this is just helpful to think about, particularly with respect to budget and with respect to the amount of capital that you'll need to get to these various inflection points, right? So the key question here is what ultimately drives value from an investment perspective in biotech? Now, the most obvious is going to be a differentiated drug, right? Data showing that the drug is safe and effective. And as you'll see, the different stars on sort of these timelines, the preclinical and clinical timeline, they all correlate to data output, right? And so that's going to be key drivers in terms of value inflection for your company over time. And I think ultimately what VC will do is they'll look to finance the company up to a particular inflection point. And then at that point, they want to see what do the data say before they actually commit additional capital to it. Now, that's good for the investor from the standpoint of that they're not exposing sort of unnecessary amounts of capital in case that data readout is negative. But it can also be good in some ways, and I think this is sort of where, in terms of the size of the overall round, it can be good for the company because, and I think there's a trend where you're seeing, particularly for sort of large platform companies, these huge Series A rounds, $100 million, $200 million. And for certain platforms, I think that makes more sense. But the thing that misses is that you don't get the value for the progress that you've made because that financing is put into the company at a particular valuation. And so I think in some ways, for certain situations, it actually, if you're going to have a positive data readout, you're going to get a value inflection. And then additional capital to bring it to the next stage doesn't come in at a higher valuation. Right? And that's something that I think some folks don't quite get. So I think that's an important point to consider. People, I can't emphasize enough about the people that you involved. And I think that, what Steve mentioned earlier about getting KOLs involved and get people involved with his story early on, that's absolutely critical. Again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but there are a number of other sort of milestones I think confer value. And the more data that you have for each of these, and it just maybe one other example in terms of epidemiology and sort of the medical need in the patient population. If you're a patient group, one thing that can confer that value is doing a natural history study. So for example, if you understand sort of you get better understanding of the epidemiology, sort of registry, and then convert into a natural history study, that just gives a better sense to investors. Well, there's truly medical need for this patient population. This is a timeline to progression. They get a better sense for what the clinical design might look like, and ultimately that ties to the cost and the timeline for getting that data. So there are a number of things that can be helpful in terms of to consider for this. Now, my last slide here is again just focusing on there's a lot of overlap with the last slide, but some of the key things that investors will focus on. And I think there's maybe just a few that I'll call out. One is valuation. Again, I think for some folks, especially perhaps this may not be as important of an issue, but I think that is something to consider strongly, because I think that, it does tie ultimately to, the control that you ultimately have in the company. But I think make sure that's appropriate for the level of perceived risk. So for example, if you come in with a preclinical company that is somewhat speculative in terms of the biology, and you're asking for a $50 million or $100 million valuation, no investor is going to take that. They're going to say goodbye, see you later. So just having a sense for what is going to be acceptable, I think, is important. Another one that I'll mention, which I think is oftentimes overlooked, is benchmarking. And I think almost every investor is going to ask for this. How does this drug compare to the other relevant drugs that are being developed in this particular area? And I think that's something that I think is very important to focus on. So for example, maybe there's a competitor molecule in phase 1 or phase 2, and you think, well, our molecule is better. Well, do you have any data to support that? Because they're going to be concerned, well, if you develop your drug and it's not better, what's going to be the market positioning? So I think if you can come into the pitch, so we've actually done these experiments head to head. If you can access their molecule or design it, synthesize it yourself, that will be very helpful. And the last thing I'll mention is just fund suitability. Again, this kind of goes back to an earlier point that I made about the type of investor. But I think also just knowing a little bit about the size of investment in terms of what is their bite size. Some investors can put, say $5 million to work. Other investors can put $50 million to work. So just understanding what is their bite size. And also I think internal knowledge of the space. You may have a really interesting opportunity, but if let's say, for example, it's in the hematology space, but you look at their investments and like 80% of their investments are neurology investments or cancer, oncology investments, they may not have the same knowledge as other investors who are more focused in the area. So just being aware of that, I think, can be very helpful. And I think another more nuanced one is fund cycle. I think this is probably more relevant for certain investors than others. I mean, some investors are kind of, they've been around for a very long time. There's no uncertainty about their ability to raise another fund, so perhaps it's less relevant. But for maybe newer investors and they're sort of more advanced in their fund cycle, they may spend time with you, but at the end of the day, maybe they only have the opportunity to make 1 or 2 more investments in that fund, and then they've got to go and raise another fund, right? So just being aware of that. So maybe your company is competing with 10 other companies, and they can only make 1 or 2 more investments in their fund because they're at the sort of the back half of their fund cycle. So just being aware of some of those dynamics, I think, can be helpful in those discussions. So with that said, I don't think this 0 is for me. So hopefully I've undershot the time in order to leave time for questions for both of us. Last thing I'll just say, feel free to send me an email. My email is ibabar@sidonco.com. Would be happy to get to know anyone in this room. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Impressive. So we can take questions at this time. We do have a microphone in the center of the room. So if you have any questions, feel free to step up. Those of you watching online, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. They come right here, and I can ask the question on your behalf. So we'll start here with your question.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the presentation. It was great to hear both of you speak. Imran, quick question about the size of your fund, which you mentioned was, I think, $34 million from NEA, Pfizer, I forget the other ones right now. And you said you started 3 companies. Can you tell us a little bit about the size of the seed and what stage those companies were? So as some people here who are starting their own companies have an idea of sort of what to expect?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I didn't cover that in great detail. So, we'll take on projects with sort of from a range of stages. So, for example, we'll take on preclinical stage companies. I'd say that we typically need to have a lead identified. So what Sidon is really not engaged in is discovery work, medicinal chemistry. But once a lead is identified, so about 18 months or so from the clinic, that's where we feel we can add the most value. Projects that are earlier than that, I think that they're sort of, it depends on the modality, for example, small molecule versus protein. We definitely will follow, and we will definitely provide help and guidance to projects that are earlier than that. And then starting, that's kind of the beginning stage. We'll take on up to phase 2 ready assets. And so actually our last company, Tiberio, took on a couple of assets from Ipsen Pharma that were phase 2 ready. So that's kind of the range in terms of stage. In terms of amount of capital, it really depends on the project. And as I said, sometimes it might require maybe a couple of $100,000 to do that killer experiment to give ourselves confidence. Other cases, it might be more capital intensive. So that seed period, we could invest up to about $3 million into a project. I think much more than that, we're going to be thinking about forming a company and then doing a Series A investment. Does that answer your question?
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kevin Fryer from Salem Oaks. This was a fantastic presentation because it was two sides of a coin that can't see each other usually. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about, well, first I'm going to ask a preliminary question. Did you have a working relationship before you got ready for this presentation?
Did we?
Do you guys know each other?
I met Imran for the first time yesterday.
Okay, so as you're sitting there listening to each other, what ideas are coming out of it?
What ideas?
When you were listening to Imran, what were you saying? Oh. And Imran, when you were listening to Steve, what were your ahas?
Right. Yeah. So for me, I look at, and I'm familiar a little bit with the Sidon model. Haven't met Imran before, but familiar with what they do. Of course, I'm always thinking that we're at that stage, right, where someone like a Sidon would probably be of great value to us, assuming that we met all of their guidelines as a company to either do initial investment in or form another company around or what it may be. So that's where my mind's always going right now.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I would just say, from my perspective is that I'm intrigued, and I think that, I find, what Steve is doing incredibly inspiring, and I think we're actually going to have conversations after this to talk a little bit more in detail. And I think for us, again, if it doesn't, meet the criteria that our investors will ultimately look for in a project, we have a lot of side gigs going on in terms of helping out entrepreneurs, and so any support that we can provide, even if it doesn't. So for an example, that might be like gene therapy, where that's a modality that Sidon has kind of strayed away from just because of the infrastructure requirements, manufacturing, et cetera. But if we can provide insights in terms of, to companies and make connections, there are actually team members that have gene therapy experience and it can make those connections. I actually did that with a group in France they were looking for some gene therapy vectors, and connected them with somebody that I know that was actually making some novel gene therapy vectors. And so for things like that, any way that we can help, we want to.
Well, and I think that if there is a point where it isn't a program for Sidon, I feel like I can reach out to Imran and he can give me some good pointers as to when we start to go maybe after a different investment group.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, that was my next question is, does Sidon do anything formally to prepare people to meet your criteria? And Steve, would you, as a new dad, jumping into this saying, I don't know how to do this, would you have valued that?
Would I value that? Well, of course, I'll value, so I'm knowledge is power, right? I'm constantly picking people's brains that are much smarter than I am, that have done the thing. I don't, like I said, you don't know what you don't know. So absolutely, I think anybody would value that.
I didn't do anything formally to kind of
Yes,
grow
we actually
families.
do. We do. So we participate in a number of mentorship programs. I think a lot of them are in the Massachusetts area just because having that face-to-face interaction is really helpful. But like Mass Challenge we're involved with. We actually have, and it's a nominal amount. We have a Sidon scholarship for early stage entrepreneurs. So we have a number of things that we're doing actively to address that.
Excellent. I'm going to take one question online real quick, and then we'll get to your question. Is VC funding interested in repurposing existing drugs for new diseases?
Good, yeah, so my response to that is that it depends on what you mean by repurposing existing drugs. If the drug is already approved, there's two things that would make it challenging. One is that there's another company that's marketing it. And in that situation, you need to go to that company and convince them that the indication that you're interested in is a compelling indication. That's, I think, probably largely from the patient perspective. If it's a drug that's generic and readily available, that's a challenging business model. And I don't know many VCs who would jump on that opportunity. However, if it's a drug that has been in development, so for example, it's been in phase 1 or phase 2, but it's not readily available, there's still IP associated with it, absolutely. And our last company is a great example of that, Tiberia, where the drug that we took on was initially focused on one indication, and we saw it didn't work for efficacy reasons, but we saw that the mechanism was relevant for another set of indications, and so we took that on. The other thing that's worth mentioning briefly is that in the orphan disease space, we have orphan drug exclusivity. So it could be a drug that maybe the IP has already expired, but if it's not readily available, it's not approved, it's not a generic, you can still get exclusivity through the Orphan Drug Act. And so and then biologic exclusivity and other things that would really incentivize you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, and your question?
Hi, I'm Sue Hagan. I'm with the National Ataxia Foundation. I'm on staff there, and I noticed a couple of our diseases were on your slide. And I've met James MacArthur. He has attended several of our scientific meetings, and you've offered support to the National Ataxia Foundation. But we're not a pharmaceutical company, so tell me how you have interest in supporting our organization.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think there are a number of, and I would first of all I would say, James is very involved with that, from my understanding, and I think that, I think there are a couple of things. One is there are opportunities to provide some funding, and I think Sidon has provided funding to other nonprofits and foundations and organizations. So there's some, I'd say somewhat limited, but hopefully still helpful amounts of capital that can be provided. But I think probably more importantly, and I think James, our president of R&D, is a good example of this, providing strategic insight and guidance from a scientific and a development perspective. That's something that absolutely the Sidon team is very interested in doing, and we have a number of organizations that we look to support in that way. We actually just participated in a bike ride and raised some money for CMT, and this is an area that we're interested in. So look to just essentially donation-based funding to support that. So there are a variety of ways in which we look to support foundations. But if you have other ideas, things that we can do and do better, we're certainly open to that.
Sounds good. Next question.
Thank you both. So my question is, the idea of a nonprofit, a foundation raising money for research in exchange for an ownership interest is somewhat of a new idea, as opposed to, like you said, just giving away the money. And though it makes a lot of sense for sustainability. So when you started on this path, did you find that academic research versus industry research, it was easier to have that conversation? Or, versus were you, like when you opened that idea up, was it, how did people respond?
Right, yeah, so you're right, it is a model that is now being used quite a bit, and I think they're getting more used to it, and by they, I say if it's an academic institution, it's usually their tech transfer office or somebody that you're working with, and so it's still tough to do, especially because they look at an organization and they look at us and they go, oh, IP, like we have a better chance of taking it forward than you do. I'm like, okay, great. Well, then we don't have to have IP, right? But we want some sort of return for everything that we're doing, and we feel that we provide enough value for that, because at the end of the day, we have a line into the patient population. We understand the disease the best, and so from an academic side, it depends on the institution. It depends on who you're dealing with. They're exhausting, frustrating conversations. It's my least, but it's part of the deal. Industry, I think I think industry is starting to get it too, but I think it's hard to approach industry as a nonprofit partner. They'll maybe sponsor your events and do stuff in that nature, but I don't know, because there's guidelines for your 501c3, and you can only have so much money flowing in from certain direction. And so to answer your question as a whole, though, I think that they're starting to get more used to it.
Excellent. And then we'll quickly get these next two questions because we're hitting up on time. Go ahead.
Hi, Patrick Reichenberger with Alta Bio, a company which is in your sweet spot for investment. So I wonder if you could take a moment to discuss the dynamics and relationship between a lead investor and a follow-on investor, and the size of an investment that a lead investor might make, and how finding that investor, sometimes it takes precedent over anything else. And just describe a little bit of the dynamic between the investors themselves and the investors and the company when it comes to lead versus follow-on.
Sure. I think that's a really good question and an interesting one. I think, there are a set of lead investors, and again, these are going to be investors that have larger funds, and that's kind of probably stating the obvious. So the OrbiMeds, the NEAs, the Longitudes, many others of the world. I think that what certain follow-on investors will look for is that they perhaps don't have the bandwidth to really do the deep dives, or they don't really necessarily have the same sort of resources to really, I guess, essentially, evaluate and sort of do heavy lifting for a particular company. And so they basically look to other lead investors that have sort of, perhaps more experience in the space, more capital, to provide them validation for a particular opportunity. Right, and so I think that when you have a lead investor, there's always sort of a bit of jockeying and a bit of things that go on in terms of the lead investor is going to want to work with other investors that they like, right? Other investors that they get along with, right? And so I think that that's something to be aware of. So for example, if you have a lead investor, like maybe just to throw it out, NEA, who's our lead investor. And obviously not going to call out any other specific names or company or other firms, but if there's an investor that NEA has had a bad experience with, then it might be a bit of a sort of challenging or different dynamic, right? So I think that whoever your lead is, they might offer some guidance in terms of other investors they like to bring into it. But there's also a balancing act here as well, because I think at the earlier stages, especially before you have a term sheet, theoretically should be a bit of opaqueness in terms of who's competing for the deal, because you want to get the bidding process going, right? You don't want OrbiMed to know that NEA and Longitude are bidding for this, because you basically want to create that competitive dynamic. What I can say, just VCs, they just happen to know sometimes that people know each other, and so things, so it's not always as sort of, I guess, as clear cut as you'd like. But I think those are the things I'd be aware of. You want to keep a bidding process. You want to be aware of whoever's furthest along, whoever actually puts down the term sheet, being aware of who they like to work with from a follow-on perspective. I guess, the follow-on investors. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Do you think as a company there's a maximum amount that you would allow a lead investor to take?
Yeah, another good question. I think it really depends on how big your round is, right? And so I think that, I would probably say, so let's just say a typical, I mean, this is not typical anymore, but I would say, because they're getting so much larger, but like say a $30 million Series A, I'd probably say a lead would do maybe half of that, maybe. There might be situations where 3 investors will come in, they'll do a third each, right? Or you might have a situation where the lead will do half of that, 15, and then they'll fill in the rest, 5, 3, 2, whatever, so smaller amounts. But I would say you'd look for the lead to do a significant amount of the round. I mean, you wouldn't have a lead that would do only $5 million, obviously, and for a $30 million round. I think you want to have sort of a core investor that would, take a good chunk of that capital for you. So.
Excellent. Okay, we are running over, but we're going to take that last question quickly.
I'm with the Yellowbrook Road Project. We're a parent of patient-led organization. Actually, Chris, from your CEO, comes to our family meetings every year, and we're one of those organizations that you're walking alongside until we're at the point where you can help us. So you've provided us with a lot of great guidance. So I just wanted to say that, number one. We are actually in negotiations, contract negotiations, with a company overseas there's a venture company who has put in seed money to build a laboratory to do research specifically for our disorder. And we are now tasked with funding it from here on. So we have got to raise millions of dollars, which obviously our typical means of fundraising is not going to yield. So if we were to go to investors, I guess I have kind of a 3-part question, and I'll try to make it quick. If we were to go to investors, how do you get someone interested when we only have 78 patients worldwide? So the likelihood of a return on investment, at least at this point, is pretty low. And then also on the flip side of that, how can we protect ourselves and any investment that we make given the M&A activity that occurs in the pharmaceutical industry?
That's a really good question, and it's a tough one because if I'm honest, with epidemiology that low, it is really challenging to get typical investors interested. 78 patients worldwide. They think about, well, this is the way the investors will break out. So, well, what's the U.S. market and maybe EU? That's kind of what they're focused on. So now you're getting down to 15, 20 patients, or maybe less, maybe more. But so I think that the typical investors, if that's, I think one thing is the question is, Are there more patients that are just undiagnosed? That's one question. So, raising awareness, and maybe that number is not 78. Maybe what if it's a couple hundred or a few hundred? Then you start
Yes,
getting.
we're very heavily trying to identify more patients.
Exactly. So efforts in that category could help. Another would be, let's say, for example, this idea of land and expand. Now, if there's a drug that has a mechanism that's relevant for that patient population, but then there's opportunity for application in a broader set of indications, that will get investors interested because they think, oh, well, we can use this as sort of proof of concept, and I obviously develop a drug for that patient population, but then there are opportunities to try to get a return on that investment. I guess ideas would be, going to companies that maybe they have a platform, they have the infrastructure already in place, because there's a bit of a, sort of a amount of infrastructure that you need to put together. I'm not talking about necessarily brick and mortar, but just infrastructure in terms of a team, getting everything put together that's required when you're starting a company for a particular disease. And so there's a company that's already exists, that's already established, and they have all that infrastructure in place. Lower epidemiology is not as much of just the delta in terms of what they need to do is not as significant. And so I think that approaching companies that might have a platform or, that might be relevant to develop a drug for the, based on the mechanism of the disease could be helpful. And then the other thing is there's sort of the nonprofit foundation routes, which are I'm sure Chris has sort of told you about. But those are some of the ideas that come off the top of my head. So.
Excellent. All right. You know what? They will stay here, and you can definitely ask your question. I know we got to get you out to the networking break sponsored by Regeneron. Please get on your apps, and give us some feedback. And thank you again, everyone.